Hello, welcome to the third video in this series on effective world language instruction. The first video dealt with the destructive impact of exposing our students too early, prematurely exposing them to the written word as a means of conveying meaning to them. I talked about how that develops within the student an unwieldy five-step thought process as opposed to the two-step process in which a native speaker thinks. And it also opens them up to inauthentic pronunciation as they inevitably employ the English phonics system to this new language that they're seeing in written form for the first time. In the second video, I talked about a solution to this problem, a solution to the problem of text-based instruction that causes our students to speak in a slow, awkward, stilted fashion. And that solution, which I proposed, I call it the natural language acquisition sequence, and it has to do, there's an 8-step process, and you could look at the second video for the details, but the general idea is you're moving from the level of an oral foundation that you've laid to phonics instruction, to reading, and much later to writing. But first, within a very limited scope of vocabulary and grammatical structures, you're laying a strong oral foundation with no exposure whatsoever to the written word, so that when the students arrive at the study of phonics, there is no potential for them to be engaging, and reading as well, there's no potential for them to be engaging in translation, in inner translation, nor is there the potential of them applying their native phonics system to this new language. And so, through the midst of these two different videos that I've presented, I've used the term relative oral fluency on several occasions, and I've yet to define what I mean by that. Now, it's a key concept because relative oral fluency I see as the watershed moment when our students are no longer thinking in their native language as they express themselves, again, within that limited context of vocabulary and structures to which they've been exposed. They're thinking in the target language, they're speaking in the target language in that desired two-step thought process. And at this point, it is finally safe for the teacher to expose them to the written word without any fear of compromising that thought process that the teacher has so painstakingly laid out. Maybe you're not convinced necessarily yet about the destructive nature of exposing students to the written word too early. Let me give you a couple of anecdotal examples here from email that I've received from former students of mine over the course of the last year. These both are students who are teaching English overseas. And let me just read their emails to you, and then I'll comment on their own observations of the kind of students that they inherited and had to work with, namely students who themselves had received a text-based instruction in their earliest stages of language learning, and the consequences that wrought in their ability thereafter to pursue fluency. The first one wrote, "Last month I spent a few weeks in a high school in a remote town in southwest China, near the border of Laos, teaching English as a volunteer to around 60 Chinese high school students there. The students barely spoke any English and disliked the subject because for them it was mainly useless memorization and grammar. While they had lists of medium-level English vocabulary memorized, they had no idea how to use them in sentences. As I was planning my lessons there, I knew that I mustn't continue to teach the students useless English, and at least help them love learning English and see its purpose during the short time I was there. So I reflected upon how you taught us French, and basically borrowed your methods of teaching languages in a way that people would learn their first language. I used pictures and videos instead of Chinese translation, had an English and sign language only rule, focused on conversational English instead of vocabulary and spelling, encouraging them to talk even if they mess up the grammar, and occasionally played games that allowed them to practice what they had learned. The students loved this teaching method, and I saw them improving so much. Originally shy students who became so embarrassed when called upon because they could only speak separate English words, by the time we left, they were able to introduce themselves, talk about the weather, greet others, and make easy conversation in English confidently. Without your class and your influence, I definitely wouldn't have come up with so many teaching ideas and methods, and the students I taught would not have improved so much. Well, of course, I'm gratified by her encouraging remarks regarding the methods that she experienced in my own French classroom, but I'd like to focus more on what her email has to say and what we can infer from some of the comments she makes regarding the prior training these students had received in their very discouraging state as she inherited them. She said that the English lessons had previously been composed of useless memorization and grammar. By grammar, I think she means analytical grammar studies in the forms of charts and rules, and that was the primary focus. She mentioned also that students had memorized lists of medium-level English vocabulary, and undoubtedly these lists, of course, were in written form and text-based form, probably providing translations into Chinese as well, but that they had no idea how to use these words in sentences. And then thirdly, she said that students could only speak separate, and by separate I think she means individual or discrete English words, probably coming from those lists of printed vocabulary. Well, in all three cases, the picture we get is of their initial instruction having been based on memorized lists, memorized printed lists, by the way, translation, and analytical grammar studies. Very significantly, note that she used the word useless on 2 occasions. You're going to hear that again in the next email in describing their prior learning. Well, a second student of mine who's also teaching, I should say, overseas, he wrote me the following. And he wrote to me as he was asking for access to my online world language program at theulat.com. He wrote, "I'm really searching for a more engaging and useful way to teach English to my students. Most students here study English for several years with the only results being the ability to complete a worksheet." Just stop for a second. This is not an overseas problem. If you consider what degree, what percentage of American world language instruction involves the simple giving to the student of a grammar packet to complete, as though that were sufficient as far as their language training were concerned. Providing a student with a grammar packet, a worksheet or a series of worksheets to complete before the oral foundation has been laid to the learning only reinforces the problems which are going to impede them from ever speaking the language fluently. But let's continue with this email. Here's the next part. He writes, "I have given my grammar class worksheets which they can complete flawlessly. When I read to them what they just wrote, they cannot understand, however. I really wish more for my students, because the current language that they're learning is useless outside of the high school classroom in this country." Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Ironic to hear this word useless used for the third time by these young teachers trying to teach English overseas. Might that not correspond to the sense of futility that many world language students here in the United States feel, as they recognize that they're jumping through hoops in order to attain a certain grade or to satisfy a high school requirement for language study, but they're fully aware at the same time that they're absolutely incapable of speaking this language, actually speaking this language that they've been studying for 2 or 3 years. What these students overseas have acquired, and what is the case with many, if not most, American students, is they've acquired a useless form of knowledge of a second language. They don't necessarily know why they have. They would tend to say, "I don't have a very good teacher." It has nothing to do with their teacher being good or not good. The issue is that the teacher has been employing a failed traditional model of world language instruction. That is to say, instruction which reposes on the foundation of text-based instruction, a premature exposure of the student to the written language, to written requirements, to written text. And so we get to the question, when is that watershed moment, that key moment, when it is safe for a teacher to expose students to the written word? In other words, what is, on the basis of what I've been putting forth in the first 2 videos, what is relative oral fluency? How can we recognize when it's in place, when it's safe to move to the printed word, when the providing of phonics instruction and then reading instruction and finally instruction in writing the language is the appropriate next step to take? Well, I'd like to get to the answer to that question kind of in a backdoor method We're going to look first at how does one measure oral fluency in a student. What is the means by which we can know confidently that our students have attained what I will later define as relative oral fluency? What is the instrument we will use to measure the degree of their fluency? Well, back in 1980, when I decided that I needed to totally overhaul the manner in which I was teaching a world language, I needed to totally throw out all that I'd assumed was true and necessary about world language instruction and come up with an approach that made sense if I wanted to train students to think the way in which a native speaker thinks when he or she speaks the native language. I knew that I needed to find a means of measuring oral expression, because I was going to start with the skills of listening and speaking, and exclusively with those skills for an extended period of time. You know, there are different levels of difficulty regarding the kinds of oral expression that we perform. The lowest level is the ability simply to say yes or no, si or no, oui ou non, to a question that's posed to us. The second level of difficulty, slightly more difficult, is to respond to such a question with a single word. The third level would be to respond to a question with a complete sentence. And there are many, many levels of difficulty, I'm sure, but the maximum that I really wanted to hit, the summit of what I wanted to attain with my students, was their ability on their part to extemporaneously, and these two words are very important, extemporaneously and spontaneously. Extemporaneously, without any reference or recourse to written notes, and spontaneously, without having specifically prepared for the speech that's about to transpire. I wanted them to be able to string together sentences to speak at length, much like I had to do when I would speak to my baseball players in France and give them a pep talk, or talk to the, like I mentioned in the first video, the parents of these baseball players and give them an inspirational talk to try and motivate them to spend time with their sons, get involved in their sons' lives. Or like when I would preach in church and speak for 25 or 30 minutes nonstop to native speakers of French. I wanted my students to gradually acquire that same ability to speak for 10 minutes at a time in an extemporaneous and spontaneous manner. And so I recognized that I needed to come up with a system which would allow me to measure their speech, to transcribe their speech, and to quantify it, and also in a qualitative manner determine the degree of accuracy, structural accuracy in their speech. I couldn't engage simply in guesswork. I think we too often fall into the trap of wishful thinking. Well, I think my students are understanding me. I think my students can speak fairly well. I think my students are thinking in the target language. Now we need a tool that allows us, something more specific than a rubric, a tool that allows us to very objectively and accurately quantify their fluency and measure the structural accuracy of their expressions. And so I came up with a system that I'd like to lay out before you. I needed to measure, as I mentioned, fluency and structural accuracy. So I created this tool, which I call the Speech Transcription and Evaluation Tool, to provide me with the data that I was looking for to determine when my students have attained, as far as I can determine, relative oral fluency, when it's time for me to move from the spoken language into phonics instruction, reading instruction, and far later writing instruction. From my website, which is www.theulat.com, you go to Teachers section. In essence, it's a teacher's manual. There you'll see three different sections. The first section involves these particular videos that you're currently watching, Insights into World Language Education. The second section, which is by far the longest, deals with using the ULAT World Language Program. And then the third section is where you want to look for this particular tool. Under Teacher Resources is the Speech Transcription and Evaluation Tool. If you click on this button here, it'll take you to the system I'm about to describe to you very rapidly. First, I had to come up with symbols that would represent different sentence parts or elements of speech. I needed a symbol that would indicate a personal pronoun and a correctly conjugated verb, for example, or a personal pronoun, a conjugated verb followed by an infinitive, or a personal pronoun followed by a reflexive verb with the correct or incorrect personal reflexive pronoun. Other symbols needed to represent a portion of a sentence which contained at least 3 words and yet which did not contain a subject and a verb. Most common example of that would be a prepositional phrase, etc. So you can see the list of the different symbols I came up with here. And I needed to incorporate symbols also that indicated when a major or minor error in grammar had been committed as well. Well, the second step in my process was to assign what I call fluency points to these different statements. When I refer to fluency, I'm talking about the sheer quantity of information, whether it be accurately or inaccurately structured, the sheer quantity of information that a student is able to communicate within a particular period of time. And so I gave each of the symbols a different point value, as you can see here. And it won't mean much to you unless you go back and see what each of these individual symbols means, but that's for another time if you'd like to study at my website the particular system that I've created. Thirdly, I needed to make allowance within my grading system for the frequency of structural errors in their speech. So I did have a means, by means of this point value, of measuring the sheer quantity of information the students were conveying to me within a limited period of time. However, I wanted my students not just to speak fluently, but to speak coherently in a fashion which was relatively grammatically correct. And so I had to come up with a means of integrating into that those fluency points, a means of deducting from their score for the errors that they performed in the midst of their talk. And by the way, I would make, as you can see, I made those the points deducted for errors depend upon the duration of the talk. A much longer talk, less would be deducted, of course, for per error. You can take a look at a sample sentence here where you can see how these particular symbols correspond to the elements in the sentence. And down below you can also see a place where in addition to recording the symbols that correspond to their speech, I inscribed in abbreviated form above the mistakes some kind of a clue to remind me of what the mistake was, so when the student would finish his or her talk, I could provide corrections about specific mistakes that the students made. Now, very important, all of this notation that I'm doing, this transcription, as well as the noting of the specific mistakes, I'm doing in real time. You can imagine that acquiring this transcription skill is nothing which happens immediately. It takes practice. It takes practice, but once you've mastered the skill, it's just the most tremendous tool at your disposal when your students give extended talks over a 2 or 5 or 10 minute period of time. Now, about relative oral fluency. Through observing my students and discerning when they were speaking without any reflection in their native language, I was able to determine that a student had attained what I refer to as relative oral fluency if they could speak extemporaneously, no written notes, spontaneously, no prior preparation for their talk, at a rate of 25 fluency points, based upon my system, of course, per minute for at least 2 minutes. I came up with that figure because I looked at the rate of fluency of people whom I knew were not speaking by means of intertranslation, either measuring my own speech or measuring the speech of native speakers of a language. Of course, I wasn't looking for the speech of native speakers speaking at a rapid rate, so rapid that they were using slang and slurring words together. No. I wanted to measure the speech of fluent speakers speaking at a reasonable conversational rate, such as the one I'm currently using right now. Once I had determined the fluency points that they would get for their own very natural speech in their native language, I could determine for myself what, according to my system, relative oral fluency corresponded to. For me, it meant, as I said, 25 fluency points per minute over a period of a minimum of 2 minutes. And you notice that I call it relative oral fluency. This is because, of course, I'm talking about fluency within the limitations of the specific vocabulary and grammatical structures of which the students have been made aware and in which they've been trained, of course. And because I wanted their speech as well to be coherent, I tempered this score by means of a deduction for structural errors in their speech. And I determined that they had to speak, as I said, with at least 25 fluency points per minute for 2 minutes, and they needed to maintain a overall score of at least 80%. And you can look at my particular system to see how I come up with a percentage for their presentation at the end of their presentation. Once the students have attained that particular level of fluency, I determine that they are ready to move into phonics instruction and reading, because I have the confidence that they're thinking in the target language and they're speaking in a two-step thought process. The topic of the fourth and the last video that I'd like to share with you, let me put it this way. I don't know what life is like in your particular part of the country or the world. However, here where I live in the north of the United States, in Michigan, along about the month of February, students are at their lowest ebb as far as their energy and enthusiasm level is concerned, because all of us are suffering from the seemingly interminable winter months when we can't go outside. We're experiencing cabin fever. And students' posture tends to communicate to you in class that they've had enough. They're kind of fed up. And they almost sit back and by their body, their posture, their body language, they say to you, "Come on, teach me. I dare you." Well, that's a terrible kind of a situation to get into. And we need to have tools that allow us to generate enthusiasm and interest in our students, even in those lowest moments of the school year. And that's what will be the topic of the last video in this series. There is a tool that we have at our disposal as world language instructors, which I think is the most critical tool for us to employ if our students are going to have a chance of attaining a fluent level of speech. So I'd like to make that the topic of the next video, and I sincerely hope that you will be able to join me. In fact, I dare you. See you soon.